A Voice in the Wilderness, the field and function of the Negro College in Science, Technology, Engineering, and Mathematics, 2024. For those of you that don't know who I am, you can read about my career in A Voice in the Wilderness. A pioneering biologist explains how evolution can help us solve our biggest problems. Now, the purpose of this book was to acquaint readers with my pioneering journey as the world's first African-American evolutionary biologist. Part 1, entitled The Unexpected Path, is mainly autobiographic. It focuses on my early life, education, first significant scientific problems. In Part 2, you meet me as a mature scientist. Part 2 is entitled How Evolution Can Solve Our Biggest Problems. It focuses on my fight with scientific racism, on the work helping to promote a dialogue between science and religion, on my work in the genomics of adaptation, and finally, how science can contribute to social justice. Now, to understand the situation of historically black colleges and universities, you really have to understand their history. So the first of these was Cheyney University, which was founded in 1837 by members of the Quaker faith. In 1851, we have the University of the District of Columbia, which was designed to educate African-American women. In 1856, Wilberforce University in Ohio was established by the African Methodist Episcopal Church. In 1865, we have Clark Atlanta, established by the United Methodist Church. In 1866, Fisk University in Nashville, Tennessee, and so on. Now, an important point with regard to today's discussion is the fact that when the 1860 Morrill Land Grant Act was passed by Congress, it established 59 land-grant universities across 37 states. Problem, of course, was that most of these institutions would not admit African Americans for higher education there, particularly in the former Confederate states. So a second Morrill Land Grant Act was established in 1890, leading to the founding of multiple historically black colleges and universities. Now, this map shows the distribution of the Morrill Land Grant 1890 institutions relative to the 1862 institutions. And as you can see, the vast majority of the 1890 land grant institutions are in the former Confederate states. Only one of them was founded in Ohio. Next slide. Now, to further understand the situation of historically black universities today, I turn to one of the greatest scholars of the history and sociology of African Americans, W.E.B. Du Bois. Now, in speaking about Reconstruction, or the Reconstruction period in America, Du Bois said, "It would be fair to the reader to say frankly in advance that the attitude of any person towards this story will be distinctly influenced by his theories of the Negro race. If he believes that the Negro in America and in general is an average and ordinary human being who under a given environment develops like other human beings, then he will read this story and judge it by the facts adduced. If, however, he regards the Negro as a distinctly inferior creation who can never successfully take part in modern civilization and whose emancipation and enfranchisement were gestures against nature, then he will need something more than the sort of facts that I am set down. But this latter person, I am not trying to convince." So Du Bois gives us a narrative of the active attack on freed people that occurred during Reconstruction in this story, and how this led to the establishment of Jim Crow. Next slide. Now, the narratives about this time period are, to say the least, slanted. There's no period in American history that has evoked more passion, scholarly interest, and purposeful misrepresentation than the Civil War and Reconstruction. My parents, for example, who grew up in Virginia, were taught that it was the, quote, war between the states. They were not taught that the war revolved around slavery. And they were taught that Lee, Stonewall Jackson, and Bedford Forrest were, quote, heroes. Reconstruction, instead, was portrayed as a time of ruthless exploitation of Southern whites. The American classic D.W. Griffin's The Birth of a Nation, which was originally entitled The Klansman and first shown in 1915, depicted the Klan as America's first action heroes. Next. Now, the author of the script, the Reverend Thomas Dixon, was a rabid racist, and he also was a classmate of later President Woodrow Wilson. Dixon's 1902 novel, The Leopard Spots, sold 200,000 copies in its first year. No other American novel came close. In The Klansman, which was written in 1905, he portrayed African American characters as subhuman. Now, he later arranged for a private showing of Birth before President Woodrow Wilson and Chief Justice of the Supreme Court Edward White. Dixon boasted afterward that Wilson had dubbed the film, quote, history written in lightning, end quote, and that White had admitted to being a member of the Louisiana Klan. This viewing had been arranged to help support the film against the growing protests of the NAACP and to get it past the Board of Censors. It turns out that actually the protests by the NAACP helped the film with white audiences, and it showed before packed houses all over America. Now, to further understand the context in which historically black universities have had to suffer and struggle over the 20th century, we need to understand what the situation was for African Americans in the early portion of the 20th century. For example, the Tulsa Massacre of 1921, in which a prosperous business district in Tulsa, Oklahoma, was destroyed by white mobs, including using aeroplanes to bomb black buildings. Over 300 African Americans were killed. At that time, Ku Klux Klan membership and influence on American politics and social life is illustrated by its 2.5 to 4 million members, fueled by anti-immigrant, anti-Catholic, anti-Jewish, and anti-black sentiments. Now, at that time, that represented, a U.S. population of 102 million. So 2.5 to 4 million was not an insignificant number. There were at least 16 lynchings of African Americans in that year. Those were public lynchings, not the number which we know little about. Now, this brings me to the title of today's lecture, Field and Function. Unless the American Negro today, led by trained university men of broad vision, now we would say men and women today, sits down to work out by economics and mathematics, by physics and chemistry, by history and sociology, exactly how and where he is to earn a living and how he is to establish a reasonable life in the United States or elsewhere. Unless this is done, the university has missed its field and function, and the American Negro is doomed to be a suppressed and inferior caste in the United States for incalculable time. Now, I'm going to say to you this morning that Du Bois was right. In other words, the Negro College has missed its field and function. Now, this was not all due to the leadership of Negro institutions. In fact, they probably played very little role in leading to the situation that we currently have today, in which African Americans are a suppressed caste in the United States. Now, I could cite all of the economic data, all of the incarceration data, all of the health disparities data, and in fact, you can read all about that in my next book, which will be published by Columbia University Press later this year, entitled 70, Why Medicine Gets Race Wrong, the Harm It Causes, and How to Fix It. But I'm not going to discuss that data in today's lecture. Now,
For those of you that are not sure what structural racism actually is, the most common and simple definition of racism is prejudice plus power. Now, what that means is anybody can be a bigot. Anybody can have irrational hatred for people that are in groups different from their own. But racism requires social power. Okay? So, personal or individual racism is important because without it, the second and most important form of racism, institutional or structural racism, would lose its ideological support. Now, when individual ideas become socially agreed fact, powerful institutions can act to discriminate. Now, a good example is redlining. It became a widespread practice in the United States to deny loans and housing to families of color. And this practice of redlining led to different capacities for accumulating wealth. And in fact, it is the main cause for the difference in wealth between African and European American families. And that difference today in 2024 is tenfold. The median wealth of a European American family is 10 times greater than that of an African American family. And most of that wealth differential comes from ownership of property, that is, in the form of their home, which was passed by generation. Now, this has influences on the institutions of education themselves. What you see here is the ranking of the top 5 historically white institutions of their endowment, by billions, compared to the top 5 historically black universities and colleges in billions. I throw in North Carolina A&T and compare it to a comparable historically white land grant, Texas A&M. So the total calculation here for historically white institutions is $158.7 billion in their endowment, compared to $1.76 billion in the comparative historically black universities. So that ratio is 90.4 to 1. I don't know how many people realize that before today. So you might have known about the overall wealth differential 10 to 1, which is egregious enough. But when you see what that does with regard to the funding of universities, which play a crucial role in the development of our labor force, particularly the labor force in STEM, there's no comparison. Now, this is from a report from the Century Foundation entitled Nourishing the Nation While Starving, the underfunding of black land-grant colleges and universities, which was published in July of 2023. So first, the 1890 institutions were denied perpetual funding for the endowment, maintenance, and support provided to the 1862 institutions, resulting in an untenable present-day inequity in endowment resources that support current operations and ensure future longevity. You're looking at, in this picture, the classroom I teach in, missing ceiling tiles. Okay? Now, this is not because my administration is incompetent and doesn't know how to repair its buildings. It's because we don't have the money. Now, think of the message that the state of North Carolina sends to the students of North Carolina A&T when they have to walk into buildings that are in this shape. Now, by the way, my building, okay, Barnes Hall, houses the biology department. We are the largest set of majors on campus, over 900 majors. By the way, 90% of whom are women. Okay? And we have 30 tenure-track faculty who teach anywhere from 3 to 4 classes, who advise greater than 60 to 70 students per semester. Yet we have to compete with the other institutions in our state for federal funding. And we do. We get NSF grants, we get NIH grants, we get Department of Energy grants, but we do this doing far more work than my colleagues at Chapel Hill, than my colleagues at NC State. And let me also make this clear. Well, this is something I don't want to get ahead of myself, but we're going to return to this, okay? We have new faculty that don't have laboratories, even though these folks have written and successfully earned NIH and NSF grants. Okay, now, states like Florida, Louisiana, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Texas have billions in underfunding for the land grant HBCUs in their states, according to a letter from Miguel Cardona, Secretary of Education, and Thomas Vilsack, Secretary of Agriculture, sent to these governors on September 2023. North Carolina A&T has a $2 billion funding disparity compared to North Carolina State, the original Moral Act of 1862 land grant institution, the letter said. Last year in the winter, we had to send our students home because our heating plant broke down and we couldn't heat 30 buildings on campus. And again, what does this say to our students when our legislature continues to allow this situation to exist? If you gave us that $2 billion today, we would rewrite the demography of science in this country within a decade. I'm going to give you examples of things that we are doing that is evidence that we could do this. So, in the 2019-20 academic year, the 1862 institutions operated with $2 billion more in total revenues, federal, state, institutional, than the 1890 institutions. As a result, Black land-grant universities operate on shoestring budgets with fewer resources for research, technology, academic instruction, student support, and community programs. But yet, we rise. Here's the research ranking presently in the UNC system. Number 1, UNC Chapel Hill with a medical school. And if you're unfamiliar with this, for most Research 1 institutions, the largest proportion of their research dollars come in through their medical school. The state legislature in North Carolina will not let us have a medical school. They have never allowed us to have a medical school. NC State, number 2, which receives a dollar match for USDA grants that they earn. We have never been given a USDA dollar match for all of the USDA money we bring in at North Carolina Agricultural and Technical State University. But we are number 3 in research grants in force right now. We are higher than Eastern Carolina that has a medical school. So we are competing, but we're competing with one hand tied behind our back and shackles to our ankles. Now, we were also excluded from federal formula payments for research and extension activities for 80 years, while their white land-grant counterparts received routine federal support. Further, federal appropriations for 1890 research and extension have fallen short of levels promised by Congress at the tune of $436 million between fiscal years 2008 and 2022. Now, I do want to point out that our infrastructure is uneven at North Carolina A&T. We have some beautiful buildings that were built recently, such as our Joint School of Nanoscience and Nanoengineering. But I will tell you the story of how it got named the Joint School of Nanoscience and Nanoengineering. It was proposed that Greensboro would host an institute to do nanoscience and nanoengineering research. Turns out that our sister institution, UNC Greensboro, which, as you know, came into existence as the White Women's College of North Carolina, there wasn't a single faculty member who did nano research at UNC Greensboro. The legislature would not give this institute to A&T. So they required that we partnered with UNC Greensboro And that's why we became the joint school. Now, how do I know all this? Because I was the associate dean for research, the inaugural associate dean for research at the joint school when it was founded in 2010. And in 2018, I was its dean. So I got to see where all the bodies were buried and how the budgets were appropriated. So now, don't get me wrong, the joint school is a fantastic facility. It's got a great faculty. We are part of the national coordinated infrastructure. We lead that in conjunction with Georgia Tech. So once again, we've done all these things with one hand tied behind our back and shackles on our ankles. Now, this picture, Department of Bioinformatics and Genomics. Okay, I know this building because I spent a lot of time there with my colleagues at UNC Charlotte. State legislature decided that Charlotte was going to be the center for computational research, bioinformatics, and has put a great deal of money into that institution. We don't have a building that's just devoted to bioinformatics. They've got literally floors of servers. It's a great place, and it's doing great work. I know the director of the institute really well. But again, okay, decisions on how funding is spent in ways that routinely underfund the historically Black institutions in this state. So, now, here are the recommendations that report made. 1, provide $600 million in new mandatory equity funding for the 1890 institutions. 2, incentivize states to eliminate funding inequities by phasing out the waiver for one-to-one state matching of federal research and extension formulas to the 1890 institutions. 3, double the minimum funding percentages for appropriations for 1890 research and extension programs. 4, provide $100 million to expand student scholarships at 1890 institutions. 5, substantially increase other federal resources for 1890 institutions. Strengthen USDA reporting to Congress on federal funding, state matching funding, and state waivers granted for 1890 education, research, and extension programs. Now, I started writing this lecture before the election. Now, I want to tell you, I was not surprised by the outcome. I knew that Trump was going to win. I thought that Harris would run better. So I expected this. Now, okay, what's going to happen to such initiatives in the Trump administration? First, most likely HBCUs and MSIs will be left to wither on the vine, per the spirit of Project 2025 for higher education. This section written by Lindsay Burke of the Heritage Center, and they were really clear. Project recommends that at present, federal money comes from federal rules and regulations attached. Burke proposes that federal dollars comes to the states as block grants with no rules or regulations attached. Now, I also was afraid that before this election, we had a Republican supermajority in North Carolina that was veto-proof. Well, the good news is that the Democratic Party picked up some seats, and now the governor will be able to veto these rules. So that's some good news. Now, they also will continue dismantling public education. Now, in this state, many of you probably don't know that we have a voucher system that gives money to wealthy families. State money for public education gives money to wealthy families so that they can choose to put their kids in segregation academies. So, now, the National Education Association reports that Donald Trump has pledged to, 1, eliminate the Department of Education, 2, defund Head Start, create a national voucher program, withhold federal funding for schools that teach our honest, accurate history, censor what teachers can say. Now, by the way, we already have legislature in several states that do that, including in North Carolina. Okay? Deport immigrant children and their families en masse. Now, I, as a student of history, tend to believe people when they say something. So when now President-elect Trump said, I need the kind of generals that Hitler had, which makes me think, what kind of generals does he need? Somebody like Oscar Dirlewanger, who was responsible for the destruction of the Warsaw Ghetto and the deportation of thousands of Jewish citizens to death camps? Is that the kind of Nazi generals he wants? Now, I mean, I still don't get this. My father landed on Utah Beach in the Normandy invasion in 1944 under fire. His commander-in-chief was Dwight D. Eisenhower. His second level of command was Omar Bradley. Now, if I were becoming the president of the United States, I would say, I need the kind of generals that beat Hitler's generals in World War II. I want Omar Bradley. I want Norman Cota, who led his troops off of Omaha up the bluffs, marking mines as he went, and saved hundreds of soldiers' lives on the beach. I would never utter this kind of nonsense to the American people, but it's precisely where we are today. And he could say this and win the election by a landslide is a wake-up call. And so I'm going to go on because I'm still, I had to pray on that one, folks. So this is going to be an anti-science administration. Now, if Trump's first term is an indicator, and I think things are going to be worse than the first term, we should expect more attacks on climate science. We should expect the elimination and reduction of support for DEI initiatives. Okay? We should expect the elimination and reduction of programs that address racial inequity, particularly via understanding of environmental impacts of structural racism in biomedical research. He is likely to appoint Robert Kennedy Jr. as head of Health and Human Services. And again, excuse me, an anti-vaxxer as the head of Health and Human Services? So I think our projection that this is going to be an anti-science administration is right on. Now, in response to that, whoa, I can't go on if that thing is out, because I can't read these slides. So we need tech help. So when this happens in my classes, I say, the man has been spying on us and has purposely cut the power because he doesn't want y'all to learn what I am teaching. Ugh, Jesse, again. Which one of you guys is in here looking like, J. Edgar Hoover, somewhere in the back, reporting, typing right now? Okay, I'm up over there, but I'm still not up on this monitor. So I'm going to quickly tell you, we published a paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences 2 years ago, and it was called Inequality in Science, Case for a New Agenda. It was authored by myself, Dr. Gilda Barabino, who was the first African-American woman president of Olin College of Engineering, Dr. Shirley Malcolm, who is the head of AAAS Sea Change Initiative, and Dr. Maureen Kearney, who is presently a program officer at the National Science Foundation. Let me move the slide forward, and maybe I can just turn around and get the gist of what I said. So, to quickly summarize, without being able to read the slide, we talk about the scientific enterprise as being distinct from the scientific method. So I am a huge champion of the scientific method. It is the best way for us to understand how nature works. And so far, there has been no other method of examining natural phenomenon that performs as well. Now, the fact that we have a method, however, doesn't make that method independent of the human beings who conduct it. Okay? So, this work, of course, has direct impact on human beings, and therefore, okay, we should be concerned about exactly how this enterprise is conducted. Now, science is a profession. Research scientists often have great personal and professional pressures. See my essay, Science in the Belly of the Beast. We face difficult decisions on how to design studies, present our results, and how to interact with colleagues. This is particularly difficult for women and underrepresented minorities in the US science workforce. Now, you probably all know the story of Rosalind Franklin and how she was treated. Today, we would call this scientific misconduct, but for that time period, it was, standard operating procedure. Researchers have an obligation to honor the trust that their colleagues placed in them. Science is a cumulative enterprise, as new research builds on previous results. If research results are inaccurate, then other researchers will waste time and resources trying to replicate and extend these results. Now, this case of World War II is a really good one because the Allies purposely misled the Nazis about their heavy water experiments. They ran bombing raids to destroy the heavy water plants, even though there were high casualties on all of those bombing runs, because they wanted the Nazis to believe they were on the right path, when in fact, they were on the wrong path. Now, they could use those to make a hydrogen bomb, but without a fission bomb, wouldn't be any good. Now, researchers also have obligations to themselves. Irresponsible conduct may make it impossible to achieve your goals, whether they're earning a degree, renewing a grant. Oh, gosh, mercy. I tell you, achieving tenure. That's back. Okay. If you want to achieve reputation of being both a productive and honest researcher, and part of that comes from critical thinking basis, you do not overstate your facts or your results. Now, researchers have obligations to act in ways that serve the public. Now, I got 5, not so simple as it sounds. Scientific results can often affect the well-being and health of individuals. Science is used by policymakers and voters to make informed decisions on issues. Taxpayer money funds scientific research. Now, thus far, we argue the scientific enterprise has primarily benefited persons of European descent. This has been both by design and by neglect. Now, there are numerous historical examples of this, so since I only have 5 minutes left in this lecture, I'm going to not go through historical examples. Key points of our paper. The history of the scientific enterprise demonstrates it has supported gender and racial inequity. Further, its institutions have allowed discrimination, harassment, and personal harm of racialized persons and women. This has resulted in a suboptimal and demographically narrow research and innovation system, a concomitant limited lens on research agendas, and less effective knowledge translation between science and society. So here are my colleagues. Now, this is how we can change this. What you see here is my research group in 2018 at the annual Research Congress of Biocomputational Evolution in Action. To say the least, most evolution conferences never see groups like this. So we're clearly doing that at North Carolina A&T. Okay? Now, the science system still remains restricted to an exclusionary subset of society. That fact influences everything else about science, particularly who participates in science, who sets research agendas, who benefits from science, and the degree to which scientific outcomes are accepted by the public. Okay, so now what I want to do, because again, I'm going to get through some more stuff, and I want to get to things that you should see. So we're doing stuff no one else has done. 2021, we graduated 1 PhD in microbial evolution, Dr. Sadi Boyd Versa, who went on to be a postdoctoral researcher at UCLA. December 22, our group graduated 2 African-American PhDs in microbial evolution. In spring of 24, we graduated Dr. Brittany Sanders in microbial evolution. We have 3 more African-American students, 2 women, 1 man, in our pipeline. Now you should recognize that the numbers that I just showed you outpace the entire rest of the country for 5 decades. And we've done this in 5 years. And again, we've done it with our hands tied behind our back and with shackles on our ankles. So we have programs that intersect kids early, okay? So this is what we think will happen if the country will adopt our new agenda. Enriched social benefits, better science, okay? Improved workforce environment, more effective translation of science. And now, to demonstrate that our work is based on a lot of scholarly work, those are the references. So I'm happy to take any questions about my talk. Can I take this off? Because I'm going to sit because my back has reached its limit.
Thank you so much. As an aside, I worked in film and I actually worked on the rise and fall of Jim Crow in 2002. And I learned more about African-American history in that than I'd ever learned in school. And I was embarrassed by that. I really appreciate everything you're doing because we need to hear this history. You did answer the question of expecting what happened on Tuesday. A lot of us have it on our minds as we go through our work. My question is, how are you taking care of yourself today? And how can you, anything you can tell us as we go through and leave this place in a couple of days to go back to our work and how we can help support what's going to happen next so that we can take care of ourselves to be in the best place to be of help?
So I'm going to tell you a story that's, again, this is not to sell books, but my publisher wants me to sell books. So in the book, I tell the story of what changed my life. So I went to the University of Michigan on a graduate research fellowship. This program had just started, and I got one of the first graduate research fellowships there was. At the time, Michigan was one of the top 2 departments in evolutionary biology. You know, the grants were there. William D. Hamilton was there. Richard Alexander was there. A whole bunch of giants in ecology, John Vandermeer, Beverly Rafsky. So I was going to my classes, and I was doing really well. But the environment at the University of Michigan was toxic to Black students. There were only 5 Black students in PhD granting programs in STEM at the University of Michigan at the time. And in my first year there, one of them in physics committed suicide. So I struggled every day with going into the building to take my classes, to do my work. And I noticed that in the morning when I was getting up to get ready to go in, I wouldn't look myself in the mirror. I literally tried to avert and not catch my own eyes in the mirror. I thought about my mother, literally, who scrubbed floors to send me to college. And then on one day, I said, no, I am not going to do what these people expect of me. And that was the day that I was able to look myself in the mirror and say, you are doing the right thing. Now, when I did that, shortly after, I was tossed out of the University of Michigan. And that was for organizing the Black Students Union. That was for calling the administration on its racism, for it not hiring Black faculty, okay? For it not signing its contract with the Graduate Employees Organization. Many of you probably know that story, that Michigan was the first university to have an a graduate students union that was recognized. Most of you don't know that without me, that wouldn't have happened. So I was written out of that story. So when you ask me how am I doing today, back then I decided that, to live in a world that is structured by manifest social injustice, you have to be willing to die. And I'm not telling people in this audience that you should die. That's not what I'm saying. But I'm saying that you have to be willing to stand. And to stand against injustice means that you may lose jobs. You may be thrown out of programs. Something bad can happen to you. But I hold, as you know, I'm a person of faith, and I hold my allegiance to a much higher authority than anything here. And so if you ask me how I am today, I am like I was every other day, the day before the election and the day after the election. Nothing has changed. We have work to do, and we need to get to it. So please come forward to the microphone so your question can be heard.
Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yeah, I can hear you.
In this talk, you mainly talked about some of the structural issues and logistical issues that are preventing universities from these universities from thriving to the degree that they should. But I'd like to know, as an evolutionary biologist, how you're engaging with some of these questions. For example, I saw you flashed a slide.
Oh gosh, you don't want me to start.
Right. So I guess, right. So I guess my question is, as an evolutionary biologist, how are you engaging these questions right now, and with whom?
Okay, so the fact that I've written 5 books on that very topic is, it's not something that, again, this lecture isn't about that. But you can just Google Joseph L. Graves Jr., okay? The Emperor's New Clothes, written in 2001. The Race Myth, written in 2004. Racism, Not Race, with Alan Goodman in 2022, which, by the way, just won the W.W. Howells Award for the best book in biological anthropology this year. So, yeah, not only do I know these people, they don't want anything to do with me because they know better. And you can go to YouTube, Google Graves-Rushton debate. So I went toe-to-toe with J.P. Rushton, and because of that debate, he changed everything he argued because he was shown up that he didn't actually understand life history evolution at all. And, again, Wilson didn't want to talk to me. He knew better. That's probably one of the reasons why. Another part of the story is that graduate award that I got from the NSF. Do you know that I applied to 2 schools, Harvard and Michigan? I received a letter back from Harvard University that literally said, "Dear Mr. Graves, we find that your qualifications are entirely in order for admission to Harvard University. However, we cannot find a faculty member who wishes to work with you. Therefore, we are declining your admission." That is historical truth. Next, please. Or over there, sorry.
Hi, thank you. My question is about the workplace structures of science. So the National Academies published several years ago in 2018 a report on sexual harassment that basically concluded that one of the major problems in science, the reason that sexual harassment rates are so high, is because of really high power differentials, which I can tell from your own personal experience. You've experienced those power differentials firsthand. So can you tell me a little bit about how HBCUs deal with the fact that science funding and kind of the structures of science incentivize this hierarchical structure, and how they try to find ways around it?
I mean, I can't,
if at all.
I can't speak to HBCUs in general, but I can speak to my HBCU. Okay, and our provost is a woman. Okay, our dean of engineering is a woman. We graduate more female engineers than black engineers than any other university in America. Okay, if you look at my research group picture that you saw, 95% of it is female. And the way I structured my research group is in a tiered mentorship structure, such that at every level, and people in that picture were undergraduates, graduate students, postdoctoral researchers, junior faculty, associate professors, and then me, the full professor. And so at every level, we are cognizant of how power dynamics operate and how we can empower people to learn. And, you know, quite frankly, we don't, sugarcoat what the enterprise is. We consistently talk about racism, sexism, patriarchy. And you can see this, by the way, if you go to our website for Precision Microbiome Engineering. So we are an engineering research center of excellence. Okay, so just Google Precision Research Engineering, ERC. You will see what we do in diversity, culture, of inclusion. We run book studies, okay, on patriarchy, sexism, racism, neural diversity. So we are doing this work, okay, and we're fully aware of how this structures the enterprise of science.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you for this talk. My name is Betsy. I help run a publication that focuses on long COVID. I've done a lot of reporting on the pandemic. And my question feels a little foreign, but hopefully I'll get around to it. I know, with COVID, like we saw such an enormous impact in terms of exposing all the cracks in the system, right? Like racism in the healthcare system and public health and people's access to all different kinds of resources that led to the kind of expected results that we saw. And, I think that instead of really reckoning with that or really taking the opportunity that posed to present change, I think a lot of people in the media, a lot of mainstream publications have just rushed us back to normal without really taking the time to kind of reckon with and address that. So I'm wondering, like, what do you see as the role for those of us here as journalists and communicators to really accurately present the problems, show the context, the historical context, the structural context that you've been talking about, and sort of do our part to show where there is potential for change?
I mean, I think you just said it.
Yeah.
Right? That's what you need to do. Now, just so you know, folks in my field saw the pandemic coming long before it hit the United States.
Yeah.
We warned the Trump administration that steps need to be taken. So you can see a whole bunch of podcasts of me in 2019 talking about how when it hits, it's going to differentially impact Black and brown communities. I said that until I was blue in the face. I was interviewed on Fox News in Atlanta with Fauci in the same program. I said it then. I published a piece in Science for the People magazine called Their Money, Our Lives, in which I projected under the current circumstances, we will see differential death and morbidity in Black and brown communities. So there are those of us out here in science who are saying these things. But, when this stuff hits, okay, and I'm saying, science writers, television, radio, they go to the folks that they know who disproportionately are white and male, and they get a different story. So one of the things you can change is looking for who are the researchers who are doing this work at historically Black universities and at minority-serving institutions, and what are they saying about these questions? So that's, I think, more of us need to be covered in the media.
Hello, I'm Laura with CASW. Thank you so much for a very powerful talk. It's kind of an extension on Betsy's question because I had a similar question, but I wonder if you could speak about how, I guess thinking about particularly your field of science, evolutionary biology, but maybe just in general, some ways that we can interrogate the science itself in our stories, which is something that, science journalists are always trying to do, not necessarily just because it got published in a journal, it's the best paper ever. And if you have any tips from your particular lens when we're reporting on science, especially science that intersects with some of the issues you talked about today, if there are things we can keep in mind.
Okay, so, this is really a sort of a question about general science literacy and being able to interrogate whether the scientific method was being accurately used in the research in question. And again, there are folks like me, and I'm not the only one, who are raising these questions in scholarly publications, in journals like the New England Journal of Medicine, in JAMA. Okay? We are publishing these papers. We are publishing these perspectives in Science and so on. So it really comes down to whether you have the capacity to question whether these stories make sense or not. What's being left out? What implicit biases are present in the way it's being reported, whose voices are being used to construct the narrative. And again, what I would argue is that there always have been scientists who have stood against the sort of standard white supremacist patriarchal mantra in science. Okay? And you need to seek those people out. We've always been there, and we're here now.
Thank you.